All right. So hopefully you had a good time on Padlet, working out what your initial reactions were to the Universal Design for Learning, both in the foundations and in the guidelines. So now we're going to go ahead and move to the actual building itself and how we design instruction with UDL in mind. So like I said before, the first and foremost thing that you want to do is you want to focus on the standard itself or the goal of what you're trying to teach, right? So if you're teaching something that doesn't have standards connected to it, whether it be an adult transition program or some sort of social skill, you still need to identify what your true north is in terms of the goal. All right, so let's spend some time. And for our context, we're going to work through a standard first because most of the time that's where what we're having to work through as teachers. So on our Padlet, you'll find a whole wealth of resources, including a link to a folder. And in that folder is a bunch of different design templates that are centered around Universal Design for Learning. And a lot of them came straight from CAST. So again, those folks are awesome. Go to www.cast.org to get your mind blown with a whole bunch of folks who can point you in the right direction towards what UDL is and how you can learn more. So first and foremost, you're going to need to write down the standard. Okay, so or drag it and drop it, copy it and paste it. Just go and figure out what the language of the standard is. So here's a standard for us: add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators, including mixed numbers, by replacing a given fraction with equivalent fractions in such a way as to produce equivalent sum or difference of fractions with like denominators. Right, like a lot. Obviously not kid friendly, that one. And I intentionally picked it because it isn't kid friendly. We have to make sure, like, I don't even know what the heck they're talking about there. So first and foremost, we've got to understand our standard. We have to break it apart and put it all back together. And we have to remember this is our goal. So this is a non-negotiable for us. Kids need to be able to do that mess I just read. And so that's fixed. We're close-fisted with it. We're open with how they show us that understanding, but we're closed with what the content is that they're actually having to show. So we need to first make sure that we understand that standard. And here are some ways that we can do that. I love to make standards visual. So believe it or not, that's what a piece of what we're trying to do or get at with this standard. So two fractions with unlike denominators being added together by using equivalents, finding like denominators, and then building that sum. So 1/4 plus 1/2 is the same as 3/4. Now I'm going to write it down so I understand it. Students will need to add and subtract fractions with different denominators by finding equivalent fractions that have the same denominator. Now I'm getting closer to an actual learning objective that my kids will be able to bring in and understand, and then build their action expression options around. Another helpful tool, and this is one doesn't always get credit in our circles, is in fact things like a digital library. So we're out in California, we're here in the Central Valley, and so going to Smarter Balanced and looking at the digital library if you're a teacher and pulling by standard what this could look like on a test. Looking at the DOK level, that's another really helpful thing so that we know what types of questions would get connected to the standard. Another option is, and my favorite option, look what it looks like. What does the standard look like in a real life context? A lot of times you can go to like word problems for math and different reading anthologies for ELA and find some examples of what this looks like in a real life context, but they might not always have pictures. They might not always have a video. They might not always have it show up as clearly as a picture like this, but it gives you the stuff to then you can go out and connect pictures. Like if I saw a word problem that says, my buddy has 1/4 of a piece of pizza, I have 1/2 of a pizza, how much pizza do we have all together? Like if I read that as a word problem, I just have to connect pictures to that. And now it's something my kids can see, something my kids can experience. Another option is to collaborate. And especially in terms of for when you're on a regular elementary, secondary campus, collaborate with folks that might be outside your PLC, outside a grade level. talk to the grade level prior to you and how this standard was taught then. Talk to the grade level above you and how that standard will be, or like the next progression of that standard will be taught. Something that gets to my heart is talk to a special education teacher. You actually will find when you work with, when the two sides of the house come together, it creates a really beautiful opportunity. Because on this side, we have a group of folks that are really used to having to think outside the box when they design instruction. And then on this side, you have a group of folks that are really used to rigorous standards-based instruction. When left to ourselves, and I'm going to say our here because I come from the SPED world, when left to ourselves, we can incubate and we can lower expectation because we're always having to think outside the box. So I have a kid, like, I couldn't just use the symbols for fractions. I would actually have to get out, cut the pizza, bring the Cuisinart rods, find the fraction tiles. I have to do that because my kids are awesome and they put me in a spot where I need to design towards their needs. And so I got really good at thinking outside the box. Where I really got pushed, though, was when a GE teacher said, no. Like, those old ways of teaching or that way of teaching will work for these standards, but I'm presenting a standard to you that those won't work with. And if it wasn't for a Miss Liao, who's a teacher in our district, pushing me to say, like, Zach, you need to be able to do more. I need to be able to go further than where you want to go. Let's keep applying these ideas that you have, but let's apply them towards the division of fractions. Let's apply them towards the decimals. Now it's a neat conversation. And then on the GE world, you guys can get lost in symbols. Like, you can get lost in things like this, and you forget that you know that equals money, but some kids don't. Or you get lost in some sort of storybook text and comparing and contrasting and writing all about it. And you don't realize that you can still compare and contrast with your voice. You can still compare and contrast to videos. You still can get to really rigorous levels of DOK based on something kids see rather than just something kids read. And so by working together, and this one I'm going to get preachy about, but that's not because I don't love you. It's just because it's really important for these two sides of an educational world to work together in order for great things to happen. Going back to the bespoke innovation idea, if those guys never went out and found the folks that really pushed them, found the folks that they knew they couldn't cut corners with, they wouldn't have created that amazing product. And so we have kids in our population, whether they be kids that would score in certain contexts as being gifted, whether they be kids that really are have support needs or disability challenges. We have the opportunity, because they're in our context, to design instruction that's really neat, dynamic, and like crazy awesome. All right, off the soapbox, down here, hanging out with y'all again. Sorry about that. I get on those sometimes. The other thing to think through is, for special education teachers especially, there are times where we have to modify content, where there are times where we have to go below the grade level standard or whatever the learning objective is in an inclusive setting. We need to remember, or here's where UDL helps us. It helps us because when a universally designed lesson comes our way, we already have a bunch of different representations, a bunch of different options for kids as well that we can connect modifications to. I like to think of it as a recipe. If I have a really well-designed lesson, it gives me a recipe with a lot of ingredients that then I can take those ingredients and I can make my own mini lessons from, or I could connect prerequisite skills to. Right? But if I have a really kind of bare bones lesson that's all in symbols that never gets to the real life application, then I don't have a lot to build from when I'm doing my modifications. For example, if I were in a class teaching and I had a kid that wasn't able to add fractions like this, but needed to just be able to label a fraction, I could say, okay, well, we're not going to worry about that. And I talked to the teacher beforehand. We're just going to take what this teacher has created and say, okay, well, before we can add, let's just identify, what is this fraction? What is this representing? And That then goes back to the analogy. I'm able to do those little mini lessons. I'm able to do those little layers of support. And it's not crazy town in terms of trying to do a completely separate curriculum. It's built into what I've already done and what my GE teachers have already done. So, I want to get to a story that exemplifies this, that I found that I was actually surprised by when I was teaching out at Fresno State. So I was teaching a group of teachers, and I was telling them about this, and I gave the analogy of the recipe. And one gal who taught at a center-based program where all of her kids were completely separate from the high school campus, she ran with it. And so what she did was she called a GE teacher at a high school campus in our town and said, "Hey, like, what books are you going through? Specifically, what book are you going through right now?" And the teacher was going through To Kill a Mockingbird. And so this special education teacher read through To Kill a Mockingbird, she herself, and got all the big imagery that came out of To Kill a Mockingbird. And what she did was, a lot of her kids had sensory boxes, so they'd go into a box and look at different things and kind of attend to the different things that they were seeing. A lot of her kids had switches that they could tap to understand cause and effect. And so what she did was she brought all the realia from the story, the real life tangible things, like the chain from the swing set, or the leaves from the tree that was described in the book. And she brought those in as the choices. The characters from the story were also, she found pictures of the different ideations of To Kill a Mockingbird that have come out in the past, and she connected pictures of those characters with switches. So the kids were making choices based on To Kill a Mockingbird. All that to say, imagine if those two worlds were to come together. We're reading a book about To Kill a Mockingbird, but there in the classroom is also realia, physical examples of the story, that some kids absolutely need, but all kids will absolutely benefit from. Now we're getting to a sweet spot of instruction. So what standard are you going to play with today? And use this time to use our Padlet and identify what your goal is moving forward, and what we'll be designing towards. Go ahead, spend some time and use our Padlet. Pause the video if you need to, and we're going to keep moving. Hopefully you paused it. I really hope they paused it. All right, awesome. There's a green light here that I keep forgetting to look at. This is just me being a rookie at this. Sorry that you guys have to put up with me for so long. All right, let's keep moving. So moving forward, we're going to also look at our next step in our design lens, and that is thinking about an assessment. So if we have a goal, now we know what we need to assess, but we still don't know the rigor levels of that assessment or the non-negotiables of that assessment. That's the work we do now around assessment. So another way of looking at assessment, and I like this, it helps me at least, I don't know if it'll help you, is I think of it as formative and summative assessments. A lot of times, well, first off, formative assessments are like, if I want to get to the Empire State Building, those are the pictures I take along the way to make sure I'm on the right route, or the route that I've planned. So when I take a picture next to Central Park, and then I take a picture as I'm moving towards the Empire State Building, and now I'm getting to the Apple Store, and then I'm walking past the Abercrombie, and now finally I've gotten nearly to the Empire State Building. And so I've taken pictures along the way, and I can trace a route through my pictures that show I'm headed in the right direction. So if you think of things like whiteboards, quick pair shares, quick CFUs, checking for understanding, that you do along the way within instruction to get you to your final destination of knowing a concept. Then you also have summative assessments. So I'm trying to get a picture of whether or not you in fact got there. That's things like exit tickets. That could be something like a common formative assessment, something more formal. And that could be even right down to a state test. It's what we do to determine whether or not we got there. Within this, there can be options here for formative assessments and giving kids options to show what they know. And then there's also options here that can be designed towards within summative assessments. It's all dependent on what you're trying to teach and how you're assessing stuff, but those are two terms that you'll need to know. So I neglected to talk about this, but you should have, pretend like I have it in front of me, your UDL guidelines out whenever you're doing lesson planning. Whenever you're designing lessons, I have those out, and you don't need to hit all of them. It's impossible, actually. But what I'm doing is like, when I'm doing assessments, I'm thinking about engagement. How do I make my assessments engaging, and how do I use those checkpoints? And then I'm also thinking about action expression. How do I give kids options? How do I give kids opportunity for goal setting? How do I give kids opportunity to navigate different tools within my assessment? So I'm having that UDL framework, those UDL guidelines out during this whole process. I love to have them on my wall. I love to talk about them with my kids. I love to just have them everywhere. And as I go through that, through time, I start to get better and better in my design. So moving on, remember your goal. Your goal is how you stay connected to what it is you're actually trying to assess. Because when you give options, it's really easy to get lost in these options. And now all of a sudden I find myself, when I'm doing a rounding problem, grading a kid's spelling. Like, if you're doing that, then you're forgetting your goal. Your goal is rounding. As long as the message got out that you needed to get out in order for a kid to show that they rounded well, I don't care about their penmanship, or I don't care about their spelling. And I know for some folks, they're cringing right now because they're like, oh, spelling matters. I get it. I agree with you. Especially in spelling, I would argue that we're getting more and more to where our tools are actually becoming more and more the norm when it comes to spelling. A lot of times there's lots of different ways to learn how to spell stuff, but I digress. Like, yes, spelling is important. Yes, writing an essay is important. And so if I were to change the goal so that it incorporated the rounding with the spelling, now I'm headed in the direction that I want to go. My argument is, first and foremost, create a goal where rounding is the non-negotiable, but that's it, so that the standard becomes the true north. But when a kid does show that they're making progress, use it like a formative snapshot. Now I can change the goal. So now I want you to round by creating an essay where somewhere in that essay, the main character has to do rounding. Now my options have to be all options that pertain to writing. And I'm going to be looking, when I'm grading using that rubric or checklist, at both whether the rounding was true and whether or not the story made sense and I could follow it, right? Does that make sense? Hopefully it does, but you can't answer back. So I'm just going to keep moving. So in thinking about your goal and what you're assessing, what absolutely has to be there? What do you absolutely need to see to show or make a defensible case that a kid has mastered a standard? Then, once you identify what those things are that you are tight-fisted about, what is negotiable? What are you okay with a kid showing you? Which ways are you okay with a kid showing you? Which tools are you okay with a kid using to show their understanding there? A lot of times I like to communicate my non-negotiables with rubrics. I love rubrics. Here, there is a series of template at this link, and I think it's also linked in our Padlet. But I love rubrics because I think that they're helpful, even like quick, like just, hey, these are the 3 descriptions of what I'm looking for. The first description is knocked it out of the park. The second description is good enough. And the third description is like, this is not enough. You need to keep working. That simple of an idea really communicates to kids what you're expecting of them, so that they can constantly be using that rubric and aligning whatever it is that they're doing to the rubric. It's really, really helpful for self-assessment. It's really, really helpful for goal setting. It's really, really helpful for coping and thinking about how to revise ideas. So I love rubrics that way. But I also love checkoff lists. I also love something as simple as like, hey, you need to get through 5 problems on this list. Here are your options for how you work out those problems, but the non-negotiable is 5 problems solved correctly, right? Something as simple as that creates that non-negotiable list that a kid can then refer back to and be like, okay, I know what the teacher wants me to do. You'll find oftentimes kids are guessing. They don't know what we want because we might have just told them one way, or because we weren't clear, or because we didn't tell them at all. We just thought we told them. the true or sure way to determine if whatever you're doing or whatever message you're trying to convey is reaching kids or isn't reaching kids is by the number of times you have to repeat yourself. If you have to repeat yourself over and over and over and over again within a lesson, saying the same exact things to kids, then you need to represent that message in a different way. That is the kids, that is the environment telling you, like, you are not representing this message in a way that we can comprehend or hold on to. Find a different representation. I'm telling you, if that's all you get from this, it will change your life because you will be less grumpy, kids will be less bothersome to you, and you will have more fun in instruction because you will not be working as hard in the moment of instruction. So okay, another soapbox moment. I'm back. I'm here. So what this looks like for us is, let's say we want you to do 5 problems. Here's the 5 problems on the board. Round to the 10th, round to the hundreds place, round to the ones. But how you do that is up to you. Oh, I'm sorry. We're not rounding at all. I'm completely wrong. We're adding fractions. Add fractions with Cuisenaire rods, add fractions with drawings, add fractions with the symbols, add fractions with base 10 blocks, add fractions with number line. We don't care how you add fractions. Here's a list of options as long as you add these 5 problems, right? So sorry about the rounding mix up. I should really change that slide. So now is a minute for you to take some time and think through, thinking about the UDL guidelines. How could you create, first and foremost, you got to create your non-negotiables, even if it's just a list. I have to see these things as they relate to that skill. Then once you have your surefire list or rubric or check-off sheet, then think of some options for how kids show what they know. The one thing I will say with your options is try to think of options that remove barriers. Here's what that means. If all your options are writing options in this goal of adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, then your options are going to alienate certain populations of that bell curve. Some kids will not be able to show their understanding. If you only use technology, some kids are going to love you for it that day. The next day, they might not love you for it, but that day they're going to be into it. But there'll be other kids that you will have left off the table for that understanding, for that lesson, because they're not into technology. Technology is really hard for them. So that's where options can remove barriers. So I'm going to think of an option for a kid that likes to write. I'm going to try to think of an option that's tech, or 2 that are tech-based. I'm going to try to think of an option like that doesn't require them to write, that would allow them to use their voice. I'm going to try to think of an option that allows drawing. There's no magic number of options out there, by the way. Realistically, I'm good with between 3 to 5 options. Beyond that, it gets a little squirrely. But my favorite part is when I get my kids to the point where I don't have to give them options. I say, I need you to show me that you know how to add and subtract these fractions. You know what we've done in the past. Here's our supply table. Here's our supply area. You have 10 minutes to do that. 5 problems, go. And where kids are able to solve that problem, think creatively, and then apply that knowledge and come up with their own options. That's a sweet spot. So, like I said, go to the Padlet, spend some time there, and then we'll come back together. Awesome. Hopefully you did that. I'm going to assume you did. So now that we've gotten through the assessment portion, now we're going to talk about, well, how are we going to teach this? What are our methods and materials going to be? And so if you notice here, we have the even back here, oops, I won't go all the way back, but whoa, it was right there. Up there in assessments, we had the blue version of the brain and the green version of the brain. Down here in methods and materials, we have the green version of the brain because engagement is everywhere. Engagement is important in all facets of a lesson design. But then we also have the purplish, pink representation of the brain, because representation is really how we represent concepts so kids get it. Remember, we're backwards designing. In thinking, whoa, don't throw up. Some people throw up with prezzies. In thinking of this, in what ways can you represent this concept? Right? So in thinking of representations, think if you're giving kids options for how they show you and their understanding, but you've only taught adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators with historical algorithm, right? You've never modeled for them what those other choices could look like. And so realistically in their heads, they have one way to add and subtract fractions that they can see in their brain, right? That they can think through and connect into. And so those options are really going to throw them off. They're really going to struggle if you throw Cuisinart rods at them without ever having represented how Cuisinart rods represent this concept, right? That's the whole idea of generalization. That's why Common Core came into place, is that a bunch of teachers, a bunch of people were teaching kids how to add and subtract, how to read, and answer questions from what they read, but teaching them how to do that in one or two ways. And then when kids were getting out into the real world, those one or two ways were really specific to educational places, but not specific anywhere else. And so it became a huge problem. It really is a huge problem. Like, it's something we run into in Sanger all the time, because kids don't take what they've learned in class and apply what they learned out in the real world. And so it's something that we're working to fix. All right. Again, don't throw up. First and foremost, think about how much time do you have? How much time do you have within a lesson or unit? That's going to really help you tailor what you're creating in the right ways, because you can over design and make it so that you've designed something that'll last you a month, but you realistically only have 3 days to teach it. And so thinking first and foremost, how many days do you have, and designing within those days. Then think holistically about this concept. Now I'm going to pause here. Like, UDL is a design lens. You saw the guidelines. They're not going to give you like the whole idea of you need to have an opening, you need to have a closing, you need to have an activating prior knowledge section, you need to do a concept development, you need to have X number of CFUs. Like, it's not going to give you that. Sorry, it's frustrating for some folks. It's saying, like, whichever paradigm you use in order to lesson plan, apply this to that paradigm. So if you're somebody that comes out of explicit direct instruction and you love like that pacing, then when you're in concept development, how are you representing that concept in a bunch of different ways? Don't just represent it 5 ways that are the exact same symbolic representation. How are you checking for understanding when you're having kids wrestle with a skill during guided practice? Are you having them show what they know? Everybody does it the exact same way. Or are you giving them options for how they show what they know? Right? If you're talking about project-based learning, how are you communicating that entry event? How are you communicating your expectations within that rubric? How are you communicating the options that kids could choose in order to meet that project requirement? Is it open or closed? So back to the methods section, you need to take whichever method that you have learned or that you are working in and start applying this lens, right? So if I'm wearing sunglasses, now my whole world is painted in the colors of the shades. You need to put your UDL shades on and apply that to whatever teaching like schema you come from, right? And well, I can tell you a little bit more about what we do or about what I do, but you really need to start with what you do and then apply a value to representing those concepts in different ways. So I do like to think about, like, how can I make it visual? How can I get kids talking about it? We do a lot with academic discourse out in Sanger, and it's really exciting having kids start to engage in some conversations. How do I get them touching that concept? How do I get them moving within a classroom? How do I get them smelling the concept? If I can get it, why not? How do I connect it to the arts? How do I connect it to sports or other things? Like, how do I make these concepts real and connected in as many different ways as possible? That's the big idea. We like to really make sure that we have some sort of concrete representation, some sort of picture representation, picture and text, and then text. Like, these are the things that we use in Sanger, but we don't necessarily keep them in this order. We just say there's lots of different ways to represent content. start finding ways that work for you, and that don't always present the ideas in the exact same way. One thing along the lines of representation that you need to consider is remember to target key vocabulary. And this is kind of tricky because when I say key vocabulary, that's exactly what I mean. I don't mean like the words around the concepts. I mean the actual words that if they don't know these words, they can't meet this learning objective. Like a lot of these words are going to show up in your learning goal. For example, if I have the word denominator in my learning goal, then it's a key vocabulary word. If I have the word add and subtract, if I have the word equivalent in my learning objective, then those are words that I absolutely need to represent in different ways within my teaching. If I have specific forms of grammar, if I have specific forms of the symbols or mathematical notation, all of those things, if they're non-negotiable for the goal, then we better be representing them in different ways, even down to the thinking, right? If I'm comparing and contrasting, then I better be using things like Venn diagrams or box tools or whatever other thing that you guys use. Those are ways that we can make the thinking visual for kids and help them understand the big ideas of a concept. So overall, focus on the representation of the goal. Make sure that you're trying to represent that concept in different ways. Think also about the symbols and the language connected to that goal, and make sure that you're representing those symbols, language, and expressions in different ways. And then think about the representation of the comprehension. Are there big ideas that kids need to understand when they are wrestling with this goal? How are you going to represent those big comprehension ideas so that they get it? Okay, so let's go back to our example on fractions. And I'm going to provide kids with opportunity, experience with actual doing stuff, the physical stuff like Cuisenaire rods or fraction tiles or base 10 blocks. And then I'm going to also do traditional algorithm. I'm going to teach that, the symbols. I'm going to have kids draw it, show them drawings. I'm going to do fraction strips, like I said before. I'm going to try to connect it to some sort of real life situation. This is key. Like every time I ask, not every time because that's hyperbole, but a lot of times that I ask, look at, I try to go to hyperbole again all the times. A lot of times I ask kids, well, what do you want to learn? Like which ways do you learn best? And a lot of times they'll say, I need hands-on. I want to see what this really looks like in life. So we got to start there. Like it's a passion point for me. Fraction mats, all of those things support universal design for learning. Now, one thing to take note is UDL does not necessarily mean technology. Technology and UDL go hand in hand. They are best buddies. But you can do universally designed lessons and content, and you don't have to necessarily have technology. When I'm teaching something like the rise and fall of a plot, I'm going to use stories, and I'm going to use different stories, and I'm going to highlight as I'm telling those stories, whether it be reading a book or talking about what happened this morning or talking about a movie I saw. And I'm going to represent the different components of the rise and fall of a plot in those different examples of a story. Now, I might have technology for that. I might not. The technology, if it's there, I'm going to use it. If it's not, I'm still going to try to find as many different representations of the rise and fall of a story plot as I can, because that's what's going to help make it sticky for kids. And so technology does make it faster. It does make choices easier. It does, in my opinion, make visuals like so much easier to use, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary. And really, if you're only using technology, you're leaving kids out. That's the story time symbol here. I had a kid who was in one of my classes, and I was the tech guy. Like I like technology quite a bit. And this gal was not having it. Like if I didn't incorporate something that was no tech, something that let her use her notebook or her colored pencils to show what she knew or to take notes and follow along, then I'd lose her. And so It's not about me falling in love with what I prefer. It's me thinking about my kids and what my kids prefer and moving from there. So from here, now we have a list of things we need to build. So I need to build a series of slides, a slide deck that helps kids see these different forms of fractions in different of adding and subtracting fractions. And I need to have some that have pictures, some that have maybe connect to a YouTube video, some that connect to the original algorithm and symbols. I also need to have my Cuisinart rods. I might, if I had a 3D printer in my classroom, I might be 3D printing examples in Realia for that. I'm gonna need my iPads, my pencils. I'm gonna need a pizza. I'm gonna need all these different things. So from here, we have a good idea, and we can divide and conquer and go out and gather what we need in order to make this lesson happen or this unit happen. So spend a minute, look at engagement and representation, talk through how you might teach this. It would be awesome if some of you linked a Padlet, linked to our Padlet, maybe a Google Slides template or a Prezi or some way in which that you think you would teach this, a Google folder that has a lesson in it so that we can see what your ideas are that you come up with. Post it to our Padlet. All right, so that's the big idea. The goal is to design lessons that are accessible for everyone. Now, I want to talk about one more thing before I close it out. Realistically, we have teaching that we do in classes where we have lessons that we're proud of. We have lessons that actually work, and we have lessons that we enjoy teaching. What we can do is when we're designing those lessons, try to retrofit or add choices, add representation types, add connections to real life experiences that kids are into and engagement. And so where we, just like we would in a building, right? Like in a historical building, we're not going to tear down the building and build something new. We're going to try to like retrofit, add an elevator shaft, put elevators in it, try to add a ramp to the side of it. But there are units, there are lessons where we need to retool the whole entire thing. And we know this as teachers. There are things that I know that I wanted to work on, to change, to throw out, to get better at each and every year. And so what we need to do is a few times a year, design from scratch some UDL lessons, and you'll find like they become your most favorite lessons to teach throughout the course of the year because the kids are actually into them, because we're thinking about what kids care about. We're thinking how kids can set goals. We're thinking about how kids monitor progress. And you'll find that once they're designed, you're doing a lot less work in teaching, and the kids are doing a lot more work in learning. And it's a fun space to be in. And much like this staircase, which was designed with how to provide access from scratch, I would argue like it creates beauty. It creates a beautiful place that like, I just want to hang out here. I like being in a place like that. And sure, I'll like being in a place like this, but you can see when it's designed for from the beginning, it creates a really fun experience for us all to be in. So here are some helpful links for UDL. I do not even want to attempt to claim any of the intellectual property around this. This is not my stuff. This is connected to the folks at CAST. And these links here will take you to a whole bunch of tools and support areas for you to learn more. And so I want to put that up there. So we want to go back to our goal. We will design lessons that support a varied array of learners. Hopefully you saw how we would do that. Feel free to leave questions on our Padlet if you want to learn more. And let's go back to our original analogy, but now let's apply it to the macro level. So if year after year, we're taking lessons, building buildings, eventually we get to the point where we have within our courses of study, within our grade levels, within whatever it is we're teaching, whole cities of instruction that kids want to be in, right? Where we're able to, depending on the needs of a kid, be able to find a space where they belong, find a space where they want to be. And there are times where like I've been to big cities where I just want to for that part of the day, I am just ready to like tear into the city and grab all that it's worth. I want to explore, I want to walk, I want to get in and out of every building. And there are times where I just want to go find a park and sit down and enjoy my family, enjoy lunch, and see what happens, right? Like The better a city is designed, the more people want to get into it and the more things they experience. And so the same thing for us within our instruction. The more universally designed buildings we can make, the more buildings we can retrofit to open up doors for people, the more kids, the humans that we work with and interact with will find a home. They'll find places of rest. They'll find adventures. They'll find places where they can be known, because we didn't even get into like the whole idea of relevancy and bringing in people's culture and bringing in people's history and their stories into our instruction. But we absolutely can and should do that with UDL as a lens. So thanks a bunch for your time. I know I can be long-winded and probably not that great to look at. So hopefully you enjoyed seeing what we had to offer today, and you can have a great rest of the day.